Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. Our May theme is focused on data visualization and collaboration for action. So really looking at what are some of the ways we can think through that database decision-making process related to how we are organizing and visualizing data. And I'm really excited to get into today's conversation. It is going to be very conversational. We've got a couple of different ways of engaging planned for us today, and I'm excited to see where that takes us. So, Chris, if you want to go ahead. As usual, we just want to start with a quick reminder that the Student Success District Network is supported by the Grad Partnership for Student Success. Um, for those of you who are new here today, the Grad Partnership for Student Success is working to build student success ecosystems across the country. We do that as a member of 12 organizations that have partnered together to provide resources, information, and support to communities and districts and schools across the country. And if you want to go ahead, Chris. The student success system is most commonly we describe and organize it usually in this framework for the four components or essential elements of student success systems. Each of our themes in some way is anchored in this framework. Today, we're really looking at kind of the bridge between supportive relationships, actionable data, and improvement actions, right? So the way that those three things all have to work together in order to lead to those effective improvement actions. Finally, the Student Success District Network is an effort that grew out of existing work over several years, and is meant to try and continue to build that opportunity for peer networking and learning for district student success teams. And so how we're going to do that today, we have organized the conversation into kind of three different sections. We're going to look at what do we mean when we say data for collaboration and action. We're going to really spend most of our time digging through these two ideas of what does it look like to take a set of data visualizations and data across different levels and purposes of use. And then from that, talk about what that kind of means for your context and how you use data with your team. And so with that, I would like to introduce my co-facilitator today. For those of you who know me, I am Marie Husby Slater, and I am the coordinator for the Student Success District Network. And today's conversation, we're joined with Chris Wine from Rise Network. We're really excited to have Chris here today and for him to share a little bit more about the work that they do with data visualization and how that supports student success teams and student success system work. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. It's to be here, and it's great to be with all of you. My name is Chris Lewine, and I lead the data work over at Rise. Rise is a continuous improvement network, a nonprofit organization that's based in Connecticut. And we work with high schools especially, but schools across the Connecticut, the Northeast, and increasingly the country to support them with their continuous improvement journeys. And data is really at the center of our work. So I'm going to be excited to share some of the positive examples that we've learned about from our work with partners. And also, I'm hoping to hear from a lot of you and what makes some of the data work that you do successful and how you're thinking about pushing it forward too. Just a teensy bit about me. I was a ninth grade math teacher before I was anything else in education. So I come at this from the educator lens. I also became a high school principal and worked for another national education nonprofit before joining Rise. So it's always been about what's happening in the classroom, what's happening to support kids to meet their potential, but increasingly, how can we use data and technology to support the professional educators who are on the ground doing that work. So really, really excited to be with you all today.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. And before we jump into the rest of the conversation, just one last quick reminder for everybody. And that is, this is meant to be a collaborative learning network, right? We're come to engage with each other, to learn from each other. And so with that, we do have norms that we like to bring into those conversations. I don't like to read through each of these. I'll just leave them up for a second and ask everyone to take a second to kind of think about where you can lean into these today and making sure that we're coming into today's session to have these really productive, collaborative conversations. All right. And with that, I think I'll hand things over to Chris for a while. And Chris is going to get us started with a little bit of an activator warm up to think about how we interact with data already.
Yeah, thanks. So we're gonna practice this we not me norm from the very beginning here. So like Marie shared, the title of today's session is Data for Collaboration and Action. And so I wanted to dig into those two words to start, collaboration and action. I think what we see sometimes is that the work of educators or the work of student success can sometimes feel like solo work or thinking work. And so what we're working on today is using data to evolve, right? From doing this work ourselves to doing this work with a team, or for doing this work from just a thinking mindset of, wow, that's a pretty graph, or wow, that's an interesting insight, to what can we do about it? And where is the action that's actually going to support students? So that's the transition we're trying to make. And I'm guessing that people in this room have an example when they either witnessed or were part of a situation when you saw solo work happening or you saw thinking work happening and you realized that it wasn't enough to improve student outcomes. And so I'd love to just hear a couple of your stories. If you feel comfortable coming off mute and sharing out loud, I think that's the best way to build community. And if you're only able to share in the chat, that is also more than welcome. So it might be a tool you were using that sort of encouraged solo work or thinking work. It might have been a district or school context. It might have been a situation where you just found yourself in this place. Ooh, excuse me about that. But can you please share an example of when solo work or thinking work wasn't enough to improve student outcomes?
Hi, everyone. I can
Hi.
definitely share a couple of examples, but I'll stick to a recent one. Just um, basically being in situations where maybe the team was struggling to share expertise, and so an ultimate decision was either going to come from one person or the other person, and say there's like seven people involved in this decision, but what came down to were these two voices that were competing for authority. So I put that under the solo work, um, because both of them, wanted to be making a solo decision,
Mm.
and as an impact of that, we have not moved work forward, and need to figure that out. That's an example.
Yeah, thanks so much for being the first one to come off mute there. I really appreciate the initiative. And sure, if the work is stalled, then kids aren't getting what they need. And if it's stalled because a team isn't functioning properly, or maybe the priorities are differing for different team members. Thanks so much for sharing. I see this in the chat too. When one or two classrooms in a grade level are effectively delivering instruction, as opposed to the entire grade level embracing a collaborative approach, effective instruction was not accessible to all students. Totally, right? We see this solo work too. Like, are we an oasis in the desert, or are we collectively building an ecosystem where students can thrive? Thank you so much for sharing that in the chat. Any other examples before we move on? Maybe including one where we saw a team or a group sort of stay in this thinking space of, wow, this is interesting, or I wonder what this is about, and not being able to make that transition to the doing space. Okay, well, I'm going to move on for now. We've broken the seal in the out loud sharing and the chat sharing. So I appreciate you two for doing that, and hope we can count on some more as we proceed. So this webinar is about how data, specifically in data visualizations and data systems, can help us make this transition to be more collaborative and more action oriented. And one thing that we've learned at Rise is when we say data systems, or how can data help us do this, there's a lot of parts of what it means to be a data system. What do we even mean when we say data systems? And we hear things like, all right, well, there's a student information system. Do we have the dashboards that we need? Maybe the personnel, a data analyst? Do we have the right reports? Are we using those for interventions, MTSS, early warning indicators, data models, benchmark assessments, spreadsheets, metrics? There is so much that goes into what a data system actually is. And sometimes we talk about using data system as a tool to move from solo work to teamwork or from thinking work to collaborative work. We might miss one or more parts of what it really means to make up a data system. So RISE has developed a resource that, while it doesn't use all the same language as some of the student success system, is really guided by the same principles and values of how we can broaden the thinking of what it takes to create data systems. And this little screenshot that you see on the slide is a resource that we're going to share at the end of this session in case it can be helpful to anyone on this call or anyone you work with, to help folks assess for themselves when we're trying to build data systems that can help us drive action and help us be collaborative. Do we have the leadership and culture in place that is necessary for that? Do we have the tools and technology in place? And do we have the mindsets and collaboration that lead to improvement team effectiveness to do this? And to us, that's what data systems mean. So it's not just the technology or the tools, it's actually all of the parts of this ecosystem working together. And so while we won't focus on this framework today, I want to set the stage with that, because when we talk about data, the tools and the technology are important, but they operate within this larger ecosystem that's at least as important. That being said, when RISE has supported partners ourselves, and we're a continuous improvement network, we do coaching, professional development, and network facilitation, we found that the tools were not always adequate for districts and schools to get what they need. So we actually built our own tool called the RISE Data Hub. And the RISE Data Hub is a tool that we built ourselves at RISE, and we share with partners, schools, and districts. And it addresses the tool and technology problems that many people face, where the tools or technology that they have available to them don't support the leadership and mindset development, or don't support the improvement team effectiveness that they need to really have that holistic impact on student outcomes. So again, I'm not going to do a demo of the Data Hub today, but I wanted to introduce this because many of my examples will draw from RISE's work, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about that as well. So today we're going to be talking about building data visualizations, and oftentimes we'll hear, hey, the team should be looking at the data, or we might even know that the student success team should be looking at the data. But what data is really the question that we want to ask as we can design purposeful data visualization. So today I'm going to walk through a couple examples that we've seen at RISE. And for each of the examples, I'm not just going to show you a visualization, I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to ask you about, as we're designing data visualizations, how might we consider the why, who, when, how, and what of that visualization? So I'm going to argue that if we're going to create a purposeful data visualization, we need to start with a motivating goal. What is the goal that is being driven towards? And even more than the goal, what do we expect people to do with this action? We can't just give them data and say, it's actionable, do actions with it. We need to think ahead of time, what are the kinds of action that we might want to spur with this data? It really matters who is looking at this data. And so the examples that we're going to go through will talk about different who and how that impacts the data visualization that's relevant. The cadence, some data is relevant on a semesterly or quarterly cadence. Other data might be relevant at a daily or weekly cadence. So defining what the cadence of action and collaboration will look like will inform the design of the visualization. And only after we've answered the why, who, and when can we start to get to what's the technology that can support this, what's the protocol, or what's the actual data and visualization itself. So this is how we're going to look at a few examples. And then at the end, we're going to send you all out into breakout rooms and invite you to discuss with each other a data challenge or a data opportunity that you're facing in your own context, and how you might use some of the examples and topics that we've discussed together to push your own work forward in your own context. All right. So I'm going to share 3 examples from RISE's context to spur some of this conversation and thinking. And before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of insight into how we chose these examples. Because when we talk about data, data is used at many different levels of the system. First of all, we need to talk about what is the breadth of student grouping that we're talking about. Many district personnel need to see district-wide data across all schools. And that's a very different data visualization challenge than one single student who needs to understand for themselves or with their family or with their mentors what they need to do in order to achieve success. So when we talk about visualizations, we need to answer what is the breadth of student grouping that we're discussing, and what's the level of aggregation that would be helpful. And sometimes seeing that individual student by student data is going to be really, really important. Other times that's too detailed, that's too noisy, and we need to aggregate up to subgroups or whole groups. So the three examples that I'm going to share today, one of them is really about one student at a time, individual data, and how RISE uses on-track report data visualizations to support students. Another example will be more at the school level, where we're not completely aggregating to just one single KPI, but we're breaking down patterns across different subgroups. And then the third example that we'll share is a little bit in between there, when we're looking at a specific grade level and actually parsing out those students student by student, so we can actually see the students within the grade level. And so I share this because these are the three examples that I'm sharing. These are not the only examples of data visualization, certainly. You'll notice I don't have an example today in the district row. That's not to say that district data is not important. It most certainly is. And in our work with partners at RISE, we found that often it's the more granular data that's actually underserved by some of the current systems that are in place. But there are data visualizations all over this canvas that are very important, and that I hope folks are thinking about. And so similarly, who is working with this data? Well, staff members working with individual students in on-track conferences. It might be leaders talking about grade level goal monitoring, or student success teams looking at a school-wide level. A lot of RISE's work focus on ninth grade on track. So I'm gonna give a couple examples today that focus in on ninth grade, but those examples are definitely generalizable to other grade levels or school-wide trends at a higher level than that. I'm going to pause really quickly. Maria, is there anything I've left out for now, or are there any other questions before we dive into these three examples and have a little conversation and get into some detail here?
Yeah, so I think on that question one, right, I'll go ahead and say if anyone does have a question, drop it in the chat now and we'll make sure to get to it. I don't see anything right now. As far as making sure we've touched on everything, I think you've got most of it. I want to real quick, since I have the floor again, uh, say one, I am really excited. I think this is the thing I'm most excited about this conversation is the five whys format that we're using to go through the why first, right? Understanding what we're trying to do, who's trying to do it before jumping to the data and the visualization. I really love that format and I'm super excited about it. Um, and I wanted to make sure, from the grad partnership perspective, to just touch base on the frame, going back to the framework that Chris shared. Part of what we really liked about that is that um, there are a lot of parallels between that approach, the approach in the framework and the way that it's organized to the essential elements and the way that the essential elements really are meant to say, hey, no more silos, right? We can't just do this little pocket here and that little pocket there. We have to think about the people. We have to think about the why. We have to think about the how. And we have to do all of those together to lead to action. And that is really, I think, very apparent in the framework. And so, no, I think those are kind of the two big things that I want to make sure we're championing on for you as we jump into this conversation.
Great. All right, well, thanks for that. So let's get into the examples here. So the first example that I want to share is on-track student conferences. And so at many RISE partner schools, there's a focus on getting students on track. again, Rise often partners about ninth grade, but this can be applicable to any grade. And maybe we could imagine the why or the action that we want to promote is to build student self-awareness, because we know that students, especially in high school, need to be agents of their own education. And we know that self-awareness is an ingredient that can motivate action among students themselves. So On Track Student Conference is a strategy that is undertaken by often all staff at some of our schools, including even non-instructional staff, but really driven by the core student success team, where every quarter we're trying to keep students on track by building their self-awareness. So this is the why, who, and when that I want to propose. And then I actually want to ask you to consider for yourself, and I'm hoping we'll hear a voice or two out loud if possible, and if not in the chat. If this were a why, who, or when that were motivating your work at your school or at your district or with your partners, what technology or protocols might you use to support this kind of strategy? And what data might you include, or what might that visualization look like? In a second, I'm going to tell you the how and the what that Rise uses, but we don't have the only answer. So I'd love to hear from y'all's perspective, and I'd love for every participant to think for a minute about, if this were the why, who, and when, what, how, and what might you use to approach that?
Good afternoon. I'm from Partnership for the Future. We're a CBO out of Richmond, Virginia, and we use Salesforce as the technology to capture the notes from our meetings with our students when our one-to-ones. And the protocol is that they meet. Each of our college access managers meets with the students on their caseload once a month for 15 minutes to just do the check-in to help them see where they are and where they're progressing. And then the visualization could be, once we have all the notes in our Salesforce, we could see what students haven't been met, or what students are in danger of not succeeding to the next level.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing. This sounds really powerful. Love the monthly cadence. Love that everyone is getting talked to. Thanks for sharing. Any other answers or examples about how you already do, or how you might address this within your context?
So we've had one come in the chat suggesting we want to look at what, as in where did the students start, and then where are they now? And so how have they progressed at this point in time? And then thinking about goals and where are we headed?
Yeah, that's great. And I could imagine, or I could ask, what the data visualization might be to sort of chart that progress over time, and to help make those trends understandable for students to build that self-awareness. Love it. Any other examples or challenges? So Rise's approach is potentially aligned with those examples in a significant way. And so what the Data Hub is able to do, the tool that I shared about at the beginning, is for any customized list of students, so whether it's sort of all students in the grade, which would be true of this example, or whether it's a school-wide action, or for a particular counselor's caseload or something like that, sort of bulk print reports from the hub. So that tool makes it very easy. And sort of similar to what Tracy said, we have a 10 to 15 minute check-in protocol where we're both looking at the data that students can see about their own progress, and then asking them about how they would describe the factors that are leading to the bright spots that they have, because every student has at least some bright spots, and also what it would take to push to the next level, especially relative to the goal. Really appreciate that being named in the chat. The goal is really important. And for these particular schools, the goal might be ninth grade on track for many students, although some students might be shooting for an even higher academic goal, or maybe it's an attendance goal or something else. And so what the hub actually does is a screenshot of the on track report that it produces. And this, from my perspective, is a data visualization because we have data here. In this case, it's student grades, and on-track measures. You'll see the grades represented numerically in that table, and the on-track measures represented graphically by the little green check mark or yellow kind of at-risk icon or the red off-track X. And for both course and grades and then attendance and behavior, we're showing that progress over time that is relevant towards the goal of being on track for the quarter or for the year. And so some of the follow-up that might happen after this strategy might include some things that Tracy mentioned about who has gotten a check-in or who hasn't, or who are some of the students who are struggling to meet their goals the most and therefore might need the most support. But actually, this report itself is a data visualization. And what RISE has found is that often student success teams don't have access to a well-formatted, easy-to-print report that can actually support that kind of self-awareness building that we know that students, especially high school students, need in order to motivate towards the action or the goals that they are working towards. So this is our example that we've come up with of what a sort of student level data visualization looks like and some of the thinking that has gone into why have we designed it that way as well. So that's example number 1. Any sort of questions, feedback, or reactions about example 1 before we move on?
I just wanted to say, hi, Chris.
Hi.
Kristen Walker. I'm also with Partnership for the Future with Tracy. I just really like how it's laid out and that the picture also shows that it's a conversation. The students can actually see, like, okay, where am I progressing? Like a lot of times students can hear you saying, oh, yeah, you're doing great, or you're on track, or you might really need to do X. And they just hear it and it goes kind of one ear, it goes in one ear and out the other. But to see, to visualize it, to be like, oh, okay, I see I am doing well here, or this is an opportunity. It's just like another checkpoint. So that's what I really like about this.
Yeah, thanks so much for naming that. And I think that goes back to what Maria and I have been saying already, which is that also builds that adult mindset, right? To have those blank boxes says, hey, we need to be listening, we need to be asking, we need to be curious. And so it's not just sort of like, here's where you are at, I'm telling you one direction, but exactly to your point, by making the data accessible in that way, we're also inviting the student or sometimes the family, because this is often used for family conferences as well, we're inviting them into that conversation. All right, loving how many voices are getting into this. So thank you so much. I am so excited that we had 3 voices on that. Let's move to example number 2 here. So here we have a different why, who, when. So imagine a goal might be similar goal to keep students on track to promote to 9th grade. Again, this is coming from the RISE context, but I think this applies to any grade or school-wide. And the action that we might want to take is to spot subgroup trends, maybe demographic subgroup trends, to inform grade-wide strategies. And the who might be a team leader in this case. So imagine maybe it's an assistant principal or a similar team lead that might be preparing for that student success team meeting or have some sort of oversight responsibilities for a group of students and faculty. And they might be checking in on this data weekly. So I want to ask the same question to the group. If this were your why, who, and when, what technology or protocol might be appropriate for this why, who, when, and what data or visualization might you imagine designing to support a need like this that a team leader and assistant principal might have? Anyone want to come off mute and talk about what this might look like in their own context? Okay, we're going to move for now. Oh, please.
Oh no,
Go
I
ahead.
was so thinking about a situation where in a district we were in between decisions about an actual tool that would collect and aggregate all this data. So while that tool was being decided upon, we actually had to use Excel. We had to use Excel. We had to run reports and then use very old school data visualizations and charts in Excel. But that did help us keep a pulse on this until the data tool was purchased.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you said that because I think sometimes when I ask what technology or what tool, people think they need to be paying an arm and a leg for it. My first technology was a clipboard with a roster and a bunch of blank columns next to it, right? As a ninth grade math teacher, that was my technology, that was my tool. And we would bring that to the grade level team meetings. Now, is that the most efficient? No. But if that's what I had, that's what we can do. So I never want folks to feel like technology is a barrier into this conversation. Often there are needs that it leaves unmet. And again, that's why RISE has our tool that we try to share with district. But no matter what your technology status is, you can absolutely support this work with the team, and Excel or Google Sheets or even chart paper or clipboards are definitely places to start if that's where people are. So I'm really happy that you said that. At RISE, the Data Hub disaggregates subgroups. The Data Hub pulls data from the student information system every night. And one of the features that we have is something called custom charts that might focus on track rates. So what that might actually look like, going to have a couple screenshots here, and then you can see it in use, is within the Data Hub, this assistant principal might need to say, okay, if I'm looking for subgroup disaggregations towards our on-track goals, what subgroups might be meaningful? Again, some of them might be demographic. And so we might pull out English learners versus non-English learners, see a gap there. And then that is meaningful because if EL students are off track at 2.5 times the rate of non-EL students, then that allows me at the assistant principal or team lead place to ask, what are the group interventions we have to support EL students more effectively, whether they're instructional strategies within the classroom or additional support outside the classroom. Those subgroups also might not be demographic, right? So we have this other chart that shows average daily attendance compared to on track. And predictably, in this synthetic data, students who are present less often at school are also more likely to be off track. And so those high level trends can be really meaningful for a team lead or an administrator to say, hey, there's a trend here that we need to dig into. And it might be more than just a couple individual students, but we need to pay attention to that underlying root cause. Now, once that underlying root cause is identified, I'm going to go into our third example here. And that third example might be where the student success team comes in. And so here what I've done is I've kept the same why to keep students on track and maybe spot subgroup trends. And I've kept the same when, weekly, but I've changed the who. And so I would love to ask you all the same question. If you're trying to do this work, and whether or not you come off mute, I'd love for everyone to be thinking about it for themselves. If you are trying to address the same need, but now instead of a team lead or an administrator's perspective, you're trying to design for a team of educators collaborating around this together, how would the data visualization look different and why? So I'd love everyone to think about that. And if there's a brave soul or two who'd be willing to come off mute to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Okay. So at RISE, what we might do with our partners to address something like this is, first of all, a protocol, because when we talk about groups of educators working together, we know that sometimes there's support needed in terms of how can we look at this data effectively? How do we balance the different skill levels, mindsets, perspectives that are in the room so we don't devolve into the situation that was described at the beginning about just two people sort of going back and forth, right? So we have something called an on-the-cusp protocol, and that means towards the end of a quarter, the Data Hub automatically populates a list of students who are within 10 points of passing their class. And we support teams to look at those students to say, what actions can we take now? Remember, collaboration and action. What actions can we take now, especially within certain subgroups, to help kids pass just those 10 points where they're shy, which can often be the difference between earning credit and not earning credit. And so the actual visualization that we produce in the Data Hub, I have a screenshot for you here, is called an on-the-cusp list. And what it does, and the student list is a data visualization that pulls together different data points from different sources and puts them together in a way that educators could use. Again, it might be surprising to see that, to think about this as a data visualization, because sometimes when we talk about visualizations, we think about sort of like fancy graphs or line charts or other things. But this to us is a data visualization. Why? As a group of teachers who might be trying to act on a pattern like the one that we saw in the previous graph, where maybe students have a lot of absences and they need more support, or maybe students who are English language learners need some more support. A team of educators knows their students. And so having those student names is important because it helps them diagnose root causes more effectively. It helps humanize what's happening because we're not at the end of the day talking about numbers. We're talking about real live human students. And it helps to get really concrete about the actions that we can take afterwards. And so a group of students, a group of teachers, excuse me, or educators might use this list in the hub to filter for just students who have a counselor of banks, or maybe just students who are almost on track, or just students who have had more than 4 absences this quarter. And they can then use that to decide on an action or an intervention to support that group of students. And so while this is not something that would be necessarily appropriate at the district level, right, at the top of that graph that we started with, when we identify the trends at the district level, at some point, if educators are going to make a difference for students, they need to know who they are actually making that difference for. And so the student list is a data visualization that we have found to be very effective at RISE at that sort of grade level team or student success team or improvement team level, when a group of educators are actually planning on actions that they can take with students. I'm going to pause again there. That's the end of our examples. So in a second, I'm going to zoom out again, and then we're going to send folks to breakouts. Any questions, reactions, or feedback on the examples that I've shared so far? Okay. So back to what Marie said about the who and the 5 whys, or the 4 whys, the 4 W's and the H. We want you to think about purposeful visualizations in your own context. So we're going to send you to breakouts in just a second. And I'm going to ask you which of these components, which of these W's is one that might be a challenge for you, or one that you might be actively thinking about. And so when we come, if it might be the why, you might ask yourself, or you might ask the other folks in your room, what is your common aim? Or what is your shared theory of improvement? If you want kids to access post-secondary pathways, for example, how are they going to do that? What is your theory about why, what the drivers are of that aim that you are interested in? So what's the motivating goal or the desired action? You might think about the who, and often that can be a challenge. And the push that we give at RISE is, how can we share this data with the people who are closest to the problem that's trying to be solved? Students, not passing their courses as often as we want to, or not having the access they need to post-secondary opportunity. And a real push to distribute that leadership, because we believe that if the data visualization is just happening at the district level or at the top of the org chart, that's a missed opportunity to democratize that access and actually motivate action from the people who are interacting most directly with students. You might be thinking about the cadence, right? You might have data that only refreshes every month or every quarter, and that might not be enough. And so you might be thinking about, how do we get data that refreshes more often, or based on the data that you do have, and you're trying to decide on what a good visualization is, how quickly do you expect an action to actually have an effect in the data? And that might help you answer that question. When you're then picking the technology, right? Maybe you feel stuck with Google Sheets or Excel, and you're thinking about what can actually help us here. You might ask, what tools on the market can help you spend less time wrangling data and more time actually making sense of it and planning actions for it? Or you might already have a tool, and the question might be, what support does the team need to work effectively together? And then finally, in 2026, we often have the problem of too much data instead of not enough data. So how can you kind of cut through the noise when you're picking out data for the visualizations and focus on what is most important? You'll notice that the examples that I shared aren't particularly busy, I think. We've really focused in on a couple data points that are actionable. So how can you help your teams do that? And what resources might be available to actually support actions there? So what we're going to do in a moment is send you into those breakout discussions and just have you introduce yourself to the other folks in your room, ask each and maybe share which component feels most difficult for you in your context and why, and consider thinking through a tricky example and maybe getting some helpful thoughts from your group mates. That's all I had. Marie, can you help get us into the breakout rooms?
Yeah, breakouts are all set to go. I'll open those up in just a second. Just so everyone knows, we're going to have probably just under 10 minutes for these conversations. So like Chris said, take a second to introduce yourselves. We'll make sure to share the slide into the breakout so you've got that for your reference. And we will see you back here in just under 10 minutes.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
All right, yeah, looks like we've got, I think that's everybody. All right. Thanks, everyone. I know that wasn't a super long time to share, but hopefully it gave you a few minutes to kind of start to talk through some of today's content and reflect on how that connects to your challenges and how you're doing your work back in your teams. Before we wrap up for the day, I do want to give everyone, we ended up with basically two groups. And so just take a minute to see, give you each a chance to share a little bit that came out of your conversation. So I'll just, if you want to drop it in the chat, come off mic or come off mute. We'll just hold a few minutes here to kind of do a real quick debrief.
One thing that came up in my group that a couple of us brought up is the idea of kind of having difficulty with like conflicting priorities of looking at student level data versus looking at kind of big picture and that zoom out, and just like different groups of people wanting to see different levels of data and maybe like not having interest in a zoomed in or a zoomed out perspective. So just managing that across the organization.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You can hear that. And I think I think we see that in a lot of places, right? Whether it's what you're familiar with, what you see as being most relevant to your work, or there's just always that time, right? Time seems to always be like enemy number one. How do we get to all of these different priorities? And I think that's part of what I really liked about the way we went through today's content and conversation was we're looking at slightly different, right? Each time we just changed the lens a little bit different and saw how we can use different data in that scenario, right? So it's not all one or the other. It's making sure we're starting with that. What's the why? What's the who? What are we trying to get at? And let that lead. So I love that, Abby. Thank you for sharing. Anything from our other group?
Um, our group, and Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's just getting people to care about the data, getting people to care about the information that we're sharing. So that can be a challenge.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think something that I would just close out on, because I think Marie's gonna close us out in a second, is, there's often a temptation in education to find like the one data visualization to rule them all. That's going to be good for all stakeholders on all levels. And I think the push here is, to Abby's point a second ago, sometimes different people need different things, and that's okay. And sometimes we need to push folks outside their comfort zone, but other times we need to listen to what they actually need as professionals and be flexible enough with our data visualization that we can be giving purposefully things that will support each person within their role. Because to Tracy's point, what we found at Rise is that when we can give folks access to data and tools that actually make their jobs either easier or help them do their jobs better, they want it. But they don't want the data that's for someone else. They don't want data that's like not relevant to them. Like Marie said, we don't have time for that. So hopefully thinking about the why, the who, the when can help us to actually design really purposeful data visualizations that might be different for people in different contexts, but that are certainly connected and that add up to some of the student success system and ecosystem that can ultimately support students.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd have one last comment in the chat about needing to figure out how to meet everyone's needs, right? I love that, Chris, the idea that we're searching for that one data visualization to rule them all, and kind of need to accept maybe that that's probably not out there. And we need to have a little bit of flexibility while we're asking for flexibility. And so with that, I do want to end us on time. So I will go ahead and, oops, I apologize. The questions weren't up. Close us out for today. So, as always, you will receive follow-up from today's session, our snapshot that's going to include some resources related to today's content and help dig into the content and think about actions to help move it forward. That snapshot also is going to include some reflection and next steps. And that will wrap up our May theme. Thank you again, Chris, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for joining and for participating throughout the whole conversation. We appreciate all of you. We do have one theme and session planned left for the current year of the Student Success District Network. That is scheduled for June 9th. And we'll be focusing on this idea of goals are important, right? We talked about that earlier today, but there is no one big goal, and you aren't successful until you reach that one big goal. So kind of thinking about within the improvement process, how are we setting those interim goals and benchmarks, and how are we identifying when we have achieved them and then celebrating that success rather than waiting for this, one big goal that's, 1, 2, 3 or more years out on the horizon. So thank you all again. Have a great afternoon, and we will see you in June.